Well, I did not grow up in church. My family, I think if you had asked them, would have said that they were Christian, but I think that would have been more just, that's what you're supposed to say. Growing up, God was really only ever referenced as an expletive. With a lot of dysfunction, it was a highly abusive environment. I learned at an early age that my literal survival depended on my performance, according to whatever the adult in the room wanted. And the shame of that was often compounded by the other adults in my life who were aware of what was going on. I grew up hearing things like, my mom used to say to me repeatedly, no one will ever love you. No one will ever want you. My dad would, just look me in the eye and say, well, you don't matter. And, as a child, you incorporate those things. So as a young adult, when I encountered Christians who tried to share the gospel with me, my thought was always, it was either, well, that's just too good to be true, or you don't know who I am. You don't know where I've been. I can look back, the benefit of hindsight, I can see all the times, and well, I'm sure not all, but so many times and places where he clearly had his hand on me. He worked through so many things, I think to keep my hope alive, because that was really all I ever had. And it wasn't until at age 25 when I became pregnant with twins that I started attending church, because I wanted them to have what I could not. At the end of every service, I would pray to receive Christ. And I would think, I've done too much. This is not possible. And that Wednesday night, I just couldn't take it anymore. And I went to the pastor and said, this is driving me crazy. Every time you lead a prayer of salvation, I always plead with the Lord, please save me. But I know he can't. He's got to have some standards, right? I mean, he's God. And my pastor just looked me dead in the eye and he said, that is not true. He said, if you prayed that prayer and you meant it, I promise you he meant it. And he said something that literally changed my life. He said, you remember this date, and whenever the enemy comes around telling you that you can't be saved, you just come back to him. January the 9th, 1990. And I did. But struggles continued, hard times continued, and I really, really wrestled with that. But that ended up being a good thing too, because I got to a point where I was finally willing and able to be just ugly honest with God. And I'll tell you, I yelled and screamed at him about things that happened in my life. How could you let this happen to a toddler? How could you let me go through this? And for so long I wrestled with a sense of purposelessness. Why would you make a human being who has no reason for taking up space on this planet? But every time that happened, when I would finally reach the end of my temper tantrum, I would hear that still small voice. And more often than not, what I heard was simply, I love you, and I have a reason for you. And so often I would have this image in my mind of Christ extending his hand to me and just saying, do you trust me? And for someone who grew up in that kind of environment, trust is really the hardest thing. But you get to a point where there have been so many miraculous events, you begin to realize he's never turned his back on me. He's never left me. And from that, you begin to understand he never will.